The Winter Bird Baker, a rhythmic sleep story of nourishment and rest. The morning arrived without fanfare, as winter mornings often do. There was no alarm, no sudden jolt into wakefulness, just a gradual surfacing from dreams into the pale, hushed reality of a snow-filled dawn. The character opened their eyes to a room transformed by that particular quality of light that only comes when the world outside has been blanketed in white overnight. It was softer than usual daylight, diffused and gentle, and it painted everything in shades of blue and silver. They lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet in that specific way that meant snow had fallen. The usual sounds from the road muted, the world wrapped in insulation. Even the creaks and setting dialogue of the old cottage seemed gentler, as if the building itself was moving more carefully, more respectfully, in deference to the hush outside. Slowly they sat up, reaching for the cardigan that lived draped over the wooden chair beside the bed. It was an old favorite, thick wool in a color that had once been a vibrant teal, but had faded over the years to something softer like sea glass. The wool was slightly pilled, the elbows worn thin, but it fit like an embrace. They pulled it on over their pajamas and stood feet finding the cool wooden floor, then the small rag rug beside the bed that their toes knew by heart. The window beside the bed was etched with frost-delicate ferns and spirals created by the night's cold. They moved closer, breath forming a small cloud against the glass, and peered out into the garden. Snow had indeed fallen, several inches at least, and it was still coming down in lazy, fat flakes that seemed in no particular hurry to reach the ground. The bird feeders that hung from the old apple tree were capped with white. The garden bench had disappeared under a smooth drift. The fence posts wore little hats of snow, each one slightly different, shaped by wind and chance. It was beautiful in that way that stopped thoughts midstream. Not a dramatic mountain vista kind of beautiful, but the quiet beauty of a familiar place made new, made strange, and wonderful by the simple addition of frozen water falling from the sky. They stood there longer than was practical, just looking. There was no urgency to move, no schedule pressing against them. This was one of the gifts of the life they'd built. Time moved at a human pace here. Eventually, the cold from the window began to seep through the glass, and they stirred, padding toward the kitchen. The kitchen was the heart of the cottage, a small square room with white painted cabinets, open shelves holding mismatched dishes, and a deep farmhouse sink beneath a window that looked out over the same snowy garden. They moved through the familiar choreography of making coffee, filling the kettle, measuring grounds into the French press, waiting for the water to boil. The kettle's whistle broke the silence gently, and they poured the water over the grounds, watching the bloom, that first expansion of coffee releasing its oils and aromatics. While the coffee steeped, they opened the back door just a crack, letting in a rush of cold air and a few stray snowflakes. The temperature was bracing, sharp against their warm face, and it felt good, clarifying. They breathed it in deeply, tasting winter, and then closed the door again, sealing the warmth back inside. Coffee poured, they wrapped both hands around the mug and returned to the window. The heat from the ceramic seeped into their palms. They sipped slowly, watching the snow fall, watching the garden transform moment by moment. And somewhere in that quiet watching, an idea began to form. Not a grand plan, not a sudden inspiration, just a gentle knowing that today was a day for making something. Today was a day for feeding the birds. It wasn't a thought that came with urgency or excitement. It was calmer than that, more certain. It felt like remembering something they'd always known, like their hands already knew the motions they would make, like the ingredients were already waiting to be combined. They'd made suet cakes before, many times, but each time felt like the first time a small ritual, a quiet gift offered to the wild things who braved the winter outside their window. They finished their coffee slowly, letting the ideas settle, letting the day gather itself. There was no rush. The birds would wait. The snow would keep falling. And they had everything they needed right here in this small, warm kitchen. When the mug was empty, they set it in the sink and began. The gathering of ingredients was a meditation in itself. They moved through the kitchen with the ease of long familiarity, knowing without looking where each item lived. The glass jar of raw peanuts came down from the top shelf of the pantry, the nuts visible through the clear glass, still in their papery red skins. They'd bought these from a farm stand in late autumn, along with apples and squash, and they remembered the woman who'd sold them, her hands stained from handling walnuts, her smile easy and gap-toothed. The black oil sunflower seeds lived in a burlap sack in the mud room, a 10-pound bag purchased from the feed store in town. They hefted the bag onto the counter. It had that satisfying weight of something substantial, something real. When they opened it, the scent rose up, earthy and faintly sweet. They scooped seeds into a large ceramic bowl. Listening to the sound they made, a gentle rainfall of their own, a whisper and patter. From the pantry came smaller bags and containers. Millet in a brown paper bag, the tiny round seeds pale gold and smooth. Cracked corn that rattled when poured. A small plastic container of dried mealworms that they de-ordered online, not the most appetizing thing to look at. But the birds loved them, especially in winter when protein was scarce. Old-fashioned rolled oats from a cardboard canister, cornmeal in a glass jar, and then the binders, the things that would hold it all together. A large jar of unrefined coconut oil, gone solid in the winter cold, creamy white and opaque. They'd have to melt it down. And chunky peanut butter, the natural kind with a layer of oil on top that needed stirring back in, the kind that tasted like actual peanuts rather than sweetened paste. They arranged everything on the counter, creating a small landscape of jars and bags and bowls. It looked abundant, generous. It looked like the kind of plenty that was meant to be shared. As they worked, they found their mind drifting to memory, not in any linear way, but in the associative manner that ingredients and scents and textures can trigger. The peanuts reminded them of their grandfather, a quiet man who'd taken them bird watching when they were 7 or 8 years old. He'd had binoculars that were too heavy for a child to hold steady, and a field guide with worn pages, and a patience that seemed infinite. They remembered standing beside him in early morning woods, barely breathing, waiting for birds to reveal themselves. He'd whispered the names like incantations: black-capped chickadee, white-breasted nuthatch, downy woodpecker, and once, memorably, a pileated woodpecker that was as large as a crow, its red crest shocking against dark feathers. The coconut oil brought back a different memory of vacation to Florida years ago, before they'd moved to this cottage, when they were still living a different kind of life in a different kind of place. They'd walked on a beach where coconut palms grew, had bought fresh coconut water from a vendor, had felt the strange displacement of being far from home. That life felt very distant now, like it had belonged to someone else. Not sadly distant, just distant. The person they'd been then was not the person they were now, and that was okay. That was more than okay. That was exactly as it should be. The oats were simply themselves, requiring no memory. Oats were elemental, humble, honest. Oats were about sustenance and simplicity. They were what you ate when you needed steadying, when you needed to feel grounded and nourished without fuss or pretense. They ran their fingers through the sunflower seeds, feeling their smooth shells, their slight oiliness. Each seed was a tiny miracle of potential plant one, and you'd get a flower taller than a person, bright as the sun it was named for, its head heavy with hundreds more seeds. But these seeds would feed birds instead, would become energy and warmth, would fuel the impossible feat of a chickadee maintaining its body temperature through a night that might drop below zero. When you thought about it that way, really thought about it, the fact that these tiny birds survived winter at all was astonishing. The character paused in their gathering, hands resting on the counter, and felt a wave of something that wasn't quite emotion, but was close to it. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves, part of the cycle of seasons, part of the web of giving and receiving that kept everything alive. They fed the birds, and in feeding the birds, they fed something in themselves, some part of their spirit that needed to be needed, that needed to be useful, that needed to participate in care. It hadn't always been this way. There had been years, not so long ago, when getting out of bed was the only thing they managed, when making coffee felt like climbing a mountain, when the idea of caring for anything, even themselves, felt impossible. Depression had a way of making everything feel pointless, and when everything felt pointless, why do anything at all? But somehow, somewhere in the slow climb back toward living, they discovered that doing things for others, even very small others, even birds, was easier than doing things for themselves. And once they started feeding the birds, once they started showing up for that small daily task, other things became possible too. They started feeding themselves more intentionally, started keeping the house a little tidier, started taking walks, started saying yes to small invitations. The birds hadn't saved them, exactly. That would be too simple, too neat. But the birds had given them a reason to keep showing up. And showing up, it turned out, was 90% of the work of living. They looked at the assembled ingredients and smiled. Yes, this was good. This felt right. And then, movement at the window caught their eye. The squirrel sat on the outer sill of the kitchen window, front paws pressed against the glass, black eyes bright and assessing. He was plump with winter preparation, his gray fur thick and slightly scruffy, his tail magnificent, that incredible plume that served as blanket and balance and communication device all at once. The character knew this squirrel, had been watching him since September, when he'd begun his frantic work of autumn-bearing acorns in the garden, raiding the bird feeders with acrobatic determination, scolding from tree branches with a chattering intensity that seemed disproportionate to his size. They'd named him the architect because of the way he surveyed the yard, the way he seemed to have plans and opinions about everything, the way he approached each task with such serious focus. Right now, the architect was clearly surveying the ingredients laid out on the counter. His nose twitched rapidly, whiskers trembling. His tail flicked once, twice a semaphore of interest and judgment. The character laughed out loud, the sound surprising them in the quiet kitchen. "Yes, hello," they said to the squirrel. "I see you there." The architect tilted his head, one ear rotating toward the sound of their voice. You're wondering what I'm making, aren't you? Wondering if it's going to meet your standards. The squirrel lifted one small paw and placed it against the glass, as if pointing, as if saying, "Pay attention," as if saying, "I'm watching you." There was something deeply comforting about this interaction. The squirrel showed up day after day, shameless in his needs, persistent in his pursuit of food. He didn't apologize for being a squirrel, for wanting what he wanted, for taking what was offered and demanding more. There was a kind of honesty in that, a purity of purpose that the character envied. Humans made everything so complicated. They tangled up their needs with shame, their desires with worthiness, their hunger with deserving. The squirrel just was hungry, and so he showed up. Simple as that. The character tapped the glass gently, a small greeting. The architect tapped back with his paw one decisive tap, like a knock, like "I'm here," like "Don't forget about me." "I won't forget about you," the character promised. "There will be plenty." There's always plenty, and meaning it, because they'd learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that there was enough. Enough food, enough time, enough care to go around. Scarcity was sometimes real, yes, but more often it was a story they told themselves of fear that tightened everything down, that made them hoard and protect and withdraw. Abundance was also a story, but it was a better one. It was a story that allowed for generosity, for sharing, for trust that needs would be met. The squirrel watched a moment longer, then abruptly launched himself from the sill, landing in the snow below with a small puff of white. He bounded toward the nearest tree, tail streaming behind him, and disappeared up the trunk. "You'll be back," the character murmured, smiling, and turned back to their work. The large pot was old, heavy-bottomed stainless steel, with a few dents and scorch marks that spoke to decades of use. They set it on the stove and scooped the solid coconut oil into it, great white spoonfuls that sat in the pot like snowballs, opaque and dense. They turned the burner to low, the lowest setting, because rushing this part would scorch the oil and ruin everything. Then they waited and watched. The transformation was slow, gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The edges of the oil closest to the pot's bottom began to soften, to turn translucent. A small pool of liquid formed beneath the solid mass. The kitchen began to fill with scent, not the strong tropical coconut smell you'd get from refined oil, but something subtler, slightly nutty, faintly sweet. They stirred gently with a wooden spoon, encouraging the process, helping the solid oil slide around in its own melting. More liquid appeared, clear as water. The solid portions grew smaller, little icebergs floating in a warm sea of their own making. And then, quite suddenly, it was all liquid clear and golden, moving easily when they tilted the pot. Into this they spooned the peanut butter, watching it land in thick dollops, watching it begin to soften at the edges. They stirred, working the peanut butter into the oil, blending until the mixture was smooth and consistent, no lumps remaining. The color shifted to a pale tan, creamy and rich. The scent intensified, now clearly peanuts, now clearly something the birds would recognize as food, as fat, as fuel. This was the base, the binder. This was what would hold everything together, what would keep the seeds and nuts accessible, even when frozen solid, what would provide the concentrated energy that small birds needed to survive cold nights. They turned off the burner and began adding the dry ingredients. First, the sunflower seeds, a cascade of black ovals pouring into the pot, disappearing into the liquid, then bobbing back to the surface. They stirred, coating each seed, folding them in. The mixture thickened immediately, gained texture and substance. Then the peanuts, rattling as they poured, each one substantial, each one a significant offering of protein and fat. More stirring, more folding. The millet, like pale sand, filling in the spaces between larger seeds. The cracked corn adding bright yellow notes. The oats soaking up oil, swelling slightly, adding bulk and binding. The cornmeal, thickening everything further. The mealworms, crispy and light, distributed throughout. With each addition, the mixture transformed. It became denser, heavier, more resistant to the spoon. The character had to use both hands now, had to put real effort into the stirring, working the spoon through the thick mass, ensuring everything was coated, everything was combined. This was the meditation. This was where thinking stopped and presence took over. The rhythm of stirring, the circular motion, the steady turning of the spoon through resistance was hypnotic. Their breathing slowed to match it. Their thoughts, which had been scattered and various, condensed down to simple awareness. The weight of the spoon, the resistance of the mixture, the slight ache beginning in their forearm, the scent filling the kitchen, the warmth from the pot, the pale light from the window, the silence of falling snow. There was something profound in this, though it would be hard to explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. Profound in the way that simple, repeated actions could quiet the mind. Profound in the way that working with your hands, creating something useful, participating in the physical world rather than just the mental one, could bring a sense of peace that no amount of thinking could achieve. They thought about resistance, how the mixture was resisting the spoon now, requiring real effort to move. Life was like that sometimes. The things worth doing often required sustained effort, required showing up even when it was hard, required pushing through resistance. Not in a violent way, not forcing, but with steady, patient persistence. The spoon kept moving, and eventually the mixture yielded. That was the lesson. Keep stirring. Keep showing up. Eventually, things combine, things come together, things become what they need to be. The warmth from the stove was spreading through the kitchen, and the character realized they were sweating slightly under their cardigan. It felt good, that warmth, that small exertion, that sense of the body working, the arms moving, the lungs breathing. They were alive. They were here. They were making something. When the mixture was fully combined, uniform and thick, they turned off the stove and stepped back. Perfect. It was perfect. Now it just needed to be shaped, to be given form. They'd collected molds over the years, a small hoard of possibilities. There were wooden molds they'd found at a craft store, some shaped like bells with scalloped edges, others like wreaths with holly leaf impressions. There were muffin tins in various sizes, standard, mini, jumbo, small terracotta pots meant for starting seeds, but perfect for this purpose. Cookie cutters in simple shapes, hearts, stars, circles, which they'd press into parchment-lined baking sheets. They laid everything out on the counter, an array of vessels waiting to be filled. They'd also cut lengths of twine and looped pieces of wire, ready to press into the molds so the finished cakes could be hung. The mixture was still warm, still pliable, perfect for working with. They scooped it out with a large spoon, filling each mold about 3/4 full, then pressing it down firmly with their fingers. The oil made their skin slick, and the mixture was pleasantly warm against their palms. Press, smooth, press again. Make sure there were no air pockets, no gaps that would cause the cake to crumble when frozen and hung. For the molds that would be hung, they pressed a loop of twine into the top, making sure it was embedded deeply enough to hold, but not so deep it would pull through. For the terracotta pots, they left the mixture slightly mounded on top and pressed a small stick into the center. The birds could perch on the rim and peck at the food. The work was rhythmic, repetitive, soothing. Scoop, fill, press, smooth. Scoop, fill, press, smooth. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, and their mind was free to wander. They thought about how we shape our lives through small choices, repeated daily. The way we speak to ourselves, that was a choice, made fresh each morning. The rituals we maintain, making coffee, making bird food, making the bed, those were choices too. The kindness we extend to ourselves and others, always a choice. Each suet cake they pressed into its mold was like those daily choices. Small, seemingly insignificant in isolation, but accumulated over time, they became something substantial. They became a life. There had been a period, was it 3 years ago now? 4, when they couldn't have done this. When the idea of maintaining any ritual beyond basic survival was laughable. When getting out of bed was the only accomplishment, and some days even that felt too hard. When the voice in their head was not kind, not supportive, but relentlessly critical, pointing out every failure, every inadequacy, every reason they didn't deserve care or comfort or joy. They didn't remember exactly when that started to change. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't a single moment of revelation. It was gradual, incremental, like the coconut oil melting, barely perceptible at first, then suddenly complete. Therapy helped. Medication helped. Time helped. But also, weirdly, surprisingly, choosing to feed the birds helped. Because feeding the birds was something they could do even on the worst days. It was simple. It was useful. It was outside themselves. And once they started doing it, once they committed to showing up for that one small task, other things became possible. If they could feed the birds, maybe they could also feed themselves not just food, but patience, compassion, gentleness. If they could show up for the birds each day, maybe they could show up for themselves too. The suet cakes accumulated on the counter, a growing collection of shapes and sizes. They were beautiful in their way, rustic, imperfect, studded with visible seeds and nuts, held together by intention and coconut oil. Each one was a small promise. I will care for you. I will help you survive. You matter. And wasn't that what they needed to hear all along? You matter. You deserve care. You deserve to survive, and more than survive, to thrive. They pressed the last mold full and stepped back, surveying their work. Maybe 25 cakes in total. Enough to fill the feeders in the garden, enough to last a couple of weeks, enough to feed the chickadees and nuthatches and woodpeckers, and yes, the architect, through the coldest part of winter. Movement at the window made them look up. The squirrel was back, watching from the sill again, tail wrapped around his body like a scarf. The character held up one of the finished cakes, showing it off. "What do you think?" they asked. "Will this meet your standards?" The architect's tail twitched twice, a flick, a pause, another flick. The character chose to interpret this as approval. "Good," they said. "I'm glad we agree." They washed their hands in the sink, working the coconut oil off their skin with warm water and soap, watching it swirl down the drain. Their hands felt soft afterward, moisturized by the oil. Another small gift. Now came the hardest part, waiting. The suet cakes needed to cool and firm up before they could be removed from their molds and hung outside. Trying to rush this would only result in crumbling and broken cakes that wouldn't hold together. So they did what they learned to do over years of practice. They made tea and they waited. The kettle went back on the stove. They selected a mug from the open shelf, a handmade pottery mug, and a glaze that shifted from deep blue to pale green, purchased from a local artist at a farmer's market. They chose a tea bag from the wooden box on the counter, chamomile and lavender, something gentle and calming. When the water boiled, they poured it over the bag and watched the water begin to change color, pale gold bleeding into clear. Mug in hand, they settled into the armchair by the window, pulling a quilt over their legs. The chair was old, rescued from a thrift store, and reupholstered in a sturdy canvas fabric, the color of moss. It sat at an angle to the window, perfect for watching the garden. They'd spent countless hours in this chair, reading, thinking, dozing, watching the seasons change outside the glass. The snow was still falling, steady and gentle. It had accumulated noticeably even in the last hour, another 2 inches at least, transforming the landscape moment by moment. The garden was unrecognizable now, all its summer definition erased. The raised beds were buried. The paths had disappeared. Everything was soft curves and gentle mounds, a study in white on white. They sipped their tea and watched individual snowflakes land on the outer sill, each one briefly visible, a tiny geometric miracle, before melting from the residual warmth of the house. How many snowflakes were falling right now? Millions, billions. Each one unique, each one beautiful, each one existing for just a brief moment before rejoining the water cycle that had birthed it. There was something both humbling and comforting in that. Humbling because it put human concerns in perspective. All our worries and dramas were just snowflakes too, briefly visible, soon melted and forgotten. Comforting because it meant that even the hard moments passed, the way snowflakes melted, the way winter always gave way to spring. They thought about impermanence, about how everything was always changing, always in flux. The garden that was now buried in snow would be green again in a few months. The birds that were struggling to find food today would be raising babies in spring, would be singing from every branch. Their own life, which had felt frozen and impossible a few years ago, had thawed and bloomed in ways they couldn't have imagined when they were in the depths. Nothing stayed the same. That was the difficult truth and the hopeful truth, all wrapped up together. They'd resisted that idea for a long time, had wanted guarantees, permanence, certainty, had wanted to know that if they just worked hard enough, if they just did everything right, they could create a life that was stable and secure and wouldn't change unexpectedly. But life didn't work that way. Life was snowflakes, unique, temporary, melting even as you tried to hold them. And somehow, accepting that, really accepting it, not just intellectually but in the body, in the heart, had brought a kind of peace they'd never experienced when they were fighting against change. Because if everything was always changing anyway, then there was no point in clinging, no point in trying to control, no point in resistance. You could just be. You could just show up for whatever moment you were in, and trust that the next moment would come, would bring what it brought, and you'd figure it out then. They sipped their tea and felt profoundly content. Not happy in a giddy or excited way, content, satisfied, at peace. This moment, right here sitting in a comfortable chair, warm under a quilt watching snow fall, knowing that in an hour or so they'd bundle up and go hang food for birds. This moment was enough, more than enough. It was everything. When had they learned that? When had they stopped needing life to be exciting or impressive or worthy of some external standard, and started being able to just be? The tea was almost gone, just a lukewarm swallow left in the bottom of the mug. Outside, the afternoon light was already starting to fade. Winter days were so short, the sun setting before it ever seemed to truly rise. But that was okay. The darkness didn't frighten them anymore. They'd learned to light candles, to make their own warmth, to be comfortable in the quiet and the dark. They stood, stretching, feeling their spine crack pleasantly. Time to check the suet cakes. The cakes had firmed up beautifully, the coconut oil now solid again, binding everything together. They began the satisfying work of releasing them from their molds. Some popped out easily, the ones in the muffin tins especially, which had smooth sides and rounded bottoms. A gentle push from beneath, and they slid right out, perfect little cylinders studded with seeds. Others required more coaxing. The wooden bell molds with their decorative scallops needed careful work with a butter knife, sliding it around the edges, loosening, applying gentle upward pressure until the cake released with a satisfying pop. They arranged the freed cakes on the kitchen table, creating a small exhibition. Each one was slightly different ratios of seeds visible on the surface, different shades of tan and brown, different textures. Some were smooth, others bumpy with protruding peanuts. Some had perfect edges, others were more rustic, a bit crumbly at the corners. They were imperfect, and that made them perfect. The character felt the familiar urge to make things beautiful, even though the birds wouldn't care about aesthetics. A cardinal didn't look at a suet cake and think, "Oh, how lovely, there are cranberries pressed into the surface." A chickadee didn't appreciate the care taken to ensure the twine was knotted just so. But the character cared, and that mattered. They'd pulled a bag of dried cranberries from the pantry and pressed a few into the surface of some of the cakes, bright red against the brown, a small pop of color, a small signature. On others they tucked in small sprigs of pine from a branch they'd trimmed earlier in the week, the needles still green and fragrant. On one they arranged sunflower seeds in a spiral pattern on top, just because it pleased them to do so. This was self-expression. This was art in its most fundamental form, the human need to make things not just functional, but beautiful. They dismissed these impulses in themselves for years, had called them frivolous, indulgent, a waste of time. Who cares how it looks? Just get it done. Efficiency, productivity, purpose, those were the things that mattered. But they'd learned, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, that beauty was its own purpose, that the act of making something beautiful, even something that would be consumed and forgotten, fed something essential in the human spirit, that creativity wasn't frivolous but fundamental, that taking the extra few minutes to add cranberries to a suet cake, even though the birds wouldn't care, was an act of love, both for the birds and for themselves. It was saying, "This matters to me, you matter to me, I matter to me. This moment matters." They stepped back and looked at the assembled cakes, now decorated with their small flourishes. Yes, this felt right. This felt complete. Now came the part they'd been looking forward to all day, picking them outside, hanging them in the garden, creating the offering. They bundled up in layers, long underwear under jeans, a thick sweater over a thermal shirt, The old wool coat that had belonged to someone else once and fit them perfectly now. A knitted scarf wrapped twice around their neck. A hat pulled down over their ears. Gloves, the thick, waterproof kind. Not the delicate kind that looked nice, but provided no real warmth. The suet cakes went into a wicker basket lined with a cloth. They pulled on boots, sturdy winter boots with good treads, and opened the back door. The cold was immediate and total, a shock even though they'd prepared for it. The air bit at their face, the only exposed skin. Their breath formed clouds. Their nostrils tried to freeze together when they inhaled. This was real cold, the kind that could kill if you weren't careful, the kind that made you respect winter as a force and not just a season. But it was also exhilarating. The characters stepped out into the snow, their boots crunching, sinking 6 inches with each step. The air was so clean, so sharp, it almost hurt to breathe. But it was clean, no city smells, no exhaust, no complexity, just cold, just snow, just the basic elements of winter. They made their way through the garden, basket in hand, and began the work of hanging the suet cakes. The first went on the apple tree, hanging from a branch at about head height. They chose this spot because it was visible from the kitchen window, because it was sheltered somewhat by the tree's trunk, because it had good sight lines in all directions, so birds would feel safe landing there. They hung the bell-shaped cake by its twine loop, adjusting it so it hung straight, so it wouldn't spin too much in the wind. The next went on a shepherd's hook they'd driven into the ground last spring, now almost buried in snow. They had to dig down to find the hook, then hung a wreath-shaped cake there. This spot was more exposed, better for birds that preferred open areas. A third went wedged into the fork of the lilac bush, pressed snugly between branches so it wouldn't fall. A fourth on a platform feeder attached to the fence. A fifth hanging from the eaves of the shed. A sixth, a seventh, and eighth they moved methodically through the garden, considering each placement, thinking about which birds might use which feeder, which spots offered protection from wind or predators, which spots offered sun in the morning or shade in the afternoon. This was care. This was intention. This was the opposite of randomness or carelessness. Each placement mattered. The physical work walking through snow, reaching up to hang cakes, bending down to clear snow from feeders, digging to find hooks and posts warmed them despite the cold. Their breath came heavier, their muscles engaged. Their body was working, was doing what bodies were meant to do, moving, lifting, carrying, creating. There was something deeply satisfying about physical work, especially when it had a clear purpose and a visible result. You could see what you'd accomplished. You could point to it and say, I did that, in a world where so much work was abstract and digital and invisible, where you could labor all day and have nothing tangible to show for it. This felt real in a way that fed the soul. They finished hanging the last cake and stepped back, surveying their work. The garden was transformed. What had been a blank white landscape was now dotted with offerings, with small stations of nourishment, with promises kept. The bells hung, twisting slowly in the slight breeze. The wreaths nestled in branches. The cakes in molds sat waiting on posts and platforms. It looked intentional. It looked cared for. It looked like someone had thought about the creatures who lived here, who depended on this place, who would need help to survive the winter. The character felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with praise or recognition. No one would see this but them and the birds. No one would congratulate them or tell them they'd done a good job. But that didn't matter. The satisfaction came from alignment. Their actions matched their values. They cared about the birds, and so they fed them. They believed in showing up, and so they showed up. They thought small acts of care mattered, and so they performed small acts of care. This was integrity. This was living in a way that felt true. A sound made them turn. The architect was sitting on a fence post, tail fluffed against the cold, whiskers twitching, eyes bright. He'd been watching the whole operation, apparently waiting to see what would be left for him. The character laughed, their breath clouding. Yes, I didn't forget about you. They reached into their pocket where they'd stashed a handful of peanuts still in their shells, which the architect preferred because it gave him something to work at, and tossed them into the snow at the base of the post. The squirrel scrambled down immediately, found a peanut, turned it over in his small hands, assessing its weight and worthiness, and then, apparently satisfied, bounded off toward a nearby tree with it clamped in his jaws, presumably to bury it for later. "You're welcome," the character called after him. They stood there a moment longer, in the cold and the falling snow, feeling the heat of exertion beginning to fade, feeling the chill creep back in. But they weren't ready to go inside yet. There was something they wanted to wait for, if they were lucky. It didn't take long. Movement at the apple tree caught their eye, flash of quick motion, a small dark shape landing on a branch. A chickadee, black-capped, tiny, brave. It clung to the bark for a moment, assessing, its head swiveling to check for threats. Then, satisfied, it hopped closer to the bell-shaped suet cake hanging there. The character held very still, breathing shallowly, not wanting to startle it. The chickadee landed on the cake itself, gripped it with impossibly small feet, and began pecking. Sharp, quick strikes of its beak, cracking seeds, pulling at peanuts, taking what it needed. It ate with focused intensity for maybe 30 seconds, then flew off with a sunflower seed, clamped in its beak off to cache it somewhere for later, or to eat in the safety of thicker cover. Almost immediately, another bird appeared. A tufted titmouse this time, slightly larger than the chickadee, but just as acrobatic. It hung upside down from the cake, pecking at it from beneath, its crest raised in a jaunty spike. Then a nuthatch, walking headfirst down the tree trunk in that impossible way nuthatches have, spiraling around to the cake and taking its share. The character watched, delighted, as more birds appeared. Word was spreading somehow, there's food here, there's good food here, come eat. A pair of chickadees now, chasing each other in spirals before taking turns at the feeder. A downy woodpecker, its red cap bright against its black and white feathers, clinging to the cake and drilling at it with serious purpose. And then, unmistakable against the white snow and the gray sky, a male cardinal landed on one of the suet bells. The character's breath caught. Cardinals were common enough, not rare, but there was something about them that always stopped time for a moment. Maybe it was the color, that impossible red, vibrant and alive and defiant against winter's monochrome. Maybe it was their size, substantial, present, not easily overlooked. Maybe it was their song, or the memory of every other time they'd seen a cardinal and felt their heart lift. This one was magnificent. His red plumage was bright even in the dim light. His crest was raised. His black mask made his eyes seem fierce and intelligent. He gripped the suet cake with strong feet and cracked seeds with his thick beak, built for exactly this purpose. He wasn't tentative or shy. He ate with confidence, with entitlement, with the certainty that this food was his to take. and watching him, the character felt a surge of emotion that surprised them in its intensity. This bird, this beautiful, vital, living creature was here, was eating food they'd made, was surviving winter because of small acts of care repeated consistently. And yes, the cardinal would have survived anyway, would have found food elsewhere, would have made it through. But still, in this moment, in this garden, they were connected, the human and the bird, the one who made and the one who consumed, the one who cared and the one who was cared for. The characters saw their own reflection in this bird, something bright and vital that had chosen to stay, to endure, to make it through the cold seasons, something that needed nourishment, not just physical food, but emotional sustenance, spiritual fuel, the kind of care that says you matter, your life has value, keep going. How many times over the past few years had they been the cardinal, showing up at feeders, therapists, friends, books, moments of beauty, small rituals, taking what was offered, surviving another day, another week, another winter? And now here they were, on the other side, offering the feeder, putting out the food, being the one who cared. Not because they'd finished their own healing. Was anyone ever finished? But because healing wasn't a linear path with an end point. It was a cycle. You received care and you gave care, sometimes simultaneously. You were the bird and the feeder. You showed up for yourself and you showed up for others. The cardinal finished eating and flew off, a streak of red disappearing into the gray branches of a neighboring tree. But the image of him stayed, burned bright in the character's mind. They turned and walked back to the house, boots crunching, heart full. Evening came early in winter, the light fading by 4:30 in the afternoon. The character lit candles throughout the cottage, one on the kitchen windowsill, one on the mantel, one on the small table beside the armchair. Not for necessity, they had electric lights, but for atmosphere, for beauty, for the particular quality of warmth that candlelight gave. They prepared dinner for themselves with the same care they'd brought to making the bird food. This was intentional. This was part of the lesson they were still learning, still practicing. Feed yourself with the same attention you'd feed others. They chopped vegetables, carrots, potatoes, onions with a good sharp knife, taking their time, making sure the pieces were even. They put them in a pot with vegetable broth, herbs from the garden they'd dried last summer, a bay leaf. They set it on the stove to simmer, filling the kitchen with warm, savory scent. While it cooked, they set the table, not carelessly, not eating standing up at the counter or sitting on the couch with a bowl in their lap, but properly. A real plate, a real bowl, a real cloth napkin, a glass of water, silverware placed just so, the candle burning nearby. This mattered. This said, you are worth the effort. You deserve to be fed well, to eat from real dishes, to sit at a table like a human being worthy of respect. They'd had to relearn this, had spent years eating whatever was easiest, fastest, required the least thought or effort. Cereal from the box, crackers standing at the counter, food as fuel only, nothing more. And that had worked, sort of, had kept their body alive. But it hadn't fed them, not really. Not in the way that sitting down to a meal you'd prepared yourself, eaten slowly, tasted fully, that fed something deeper. When the soup was ready, they ladled it into the bowl and carried it to the table. They sat down. They looked at it for a moment, the steam rising, the vegetables visible in the broth, the herbs floating on the surface. They picked up their spoon, and they ate slowly, tasting each bite, being present with it, the warmth spreading through them, the salt and savory, the texture of soft vegetables, the simple, profound pleasure of being nourished. Outside, full dark had fallen. Through the window, they could just barely make out the shapes of the suet cakes hanging in the garden, pale against dark branches. Tomorrow morning the birds would come back, and the morning after that, and the one after that, and they would be there, hanging feeders, checking supplies, making more cakes when these ran out. This was the rhythm they'd found. This was the life they'd built, one small choice at a time, one act of care at a time. Feed the birds. Feed yourself. Show up. Be present. Choose kindness when you can. Rest when you need to. Keep going. It wasn't dramatic or exciting. It wouldn't make a good story in the conventional sense, no great conflict, no triumphant resolution, just a quiet accumulation of ordinary days lived with intention. But it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The character finished their soup and washed their dish, dried it, put it away. They made tea, again peppermint this time, bright and refreshing. They settled back into the armchair with a book, the quilt over their legs, the candle burning on the nearby table. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the cottage was warm and quiet and safe. And somewhere in the dark garden, birds were roosting in trees, their bellies full of suet and seeds, their tiny hearts beating fast, keeping them warm through the cold night. Tomorrow, the character would check the feeders, would refill them if needed, would probably make another batch of suet cakes in a week or two, would keep showing up, keep feeding, keep caring, because that's what you did. You showed up. You fed what needed feeding, the birds, yes, but also yourself, your body with good food, your spirit with beauty and ritual, your heart with kindness and patience. You showed up and you kept showing up, and somehow that was enough. Somehow that made a life worth living. The characters sipped their tea and turned the page of their book and felt, once again, that deep contentment that had nothing to do with achievement or recognition or being anything other than exactly who and what they were. A person in a cottage feeding birds, feeding themselves, living quietly, living well. Outside, a cardinal, maybe the same one, maybe a different one settled into a spruce tree for the night, fluffing its feathers against the cold, tucking its head under its wing. Tomorrow it would wake and find food waiting, because someone had cared enough to make it, to hang it, to keep showing up. And inside, the character read their book by candlelight, warm and fed and at peace. This was the life they'd built. This was the winter they would survive and even surprisingly, beautifully thrive in. One suet cake at a time. One small act of care at a time. One quiet moment of presence at a time. It was enough. It was everything. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself breathing a little slower, settling a little deeper into wherever you are right now, please consider showing your support with a like, and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys. We're building a community of people who understand that the small acts matter, that caring for ourselves and for the world around us is not frivolous but fundamental, that peace is found not in grand gestures but in the gentle repetition of showing up, feeding what needs feeding, and resting when rest is needed. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.